What if everything you thought you knew about spiritual growth was actually holding you back from the very transformation you're seeking? Here's a startling truth that most spiritual teachers won't tell you. The greatest obstacle to genuine spiritual awakening isn't doubt, it isn't lack of faith, and it certainly isn't insufficient knowledge. The most dangerous trap that catches even the most dedicated seekers is something far more subtle and devastating: the illusion of understanding. Has this ever happened to you? You've read the books, attended the seminars, memorized the scriptures, and somewhere along the way, you convinced yourself that accumulating spiritual information equals spiritual transformation. This is precisely what Emmet Fox warned about when he spoke of thinking like Christ. Most people believe that following Christ means emotional devotion, repeating his words or trying to imitate his actions from 2,000 years ago. But what you're about to discover might surprise you. Thinking like Christ has nothing to do with sentimental attachment or religious performance. It's about something infinitely more radical and transformative. But before we begin, please hit the like button and let me know where in the world you're watching from today. It's always fascinating seeing who's joining us from around the world. The Christ consciousness isn't a historical figure you admire from a distance. It's not a set of moral guidelines or inspirational quotes to post on social media. Christ consciousness is a completely different operating system for your mind. A way of thinking that operates from principle rather than circumstance, from cause rather than effect, from the eternal rather than the temporal. Stay with me until the end, because what we're exploring today isn't spiritual theory you can casually consume. This isn't feel-good content designed to comfort your ego or validate what you already believe. This is advanced spiritual technology that demands everything from you: your willingness to examine every thought, your courage to release worldly thinking patterns, and your commitment to mental discipline that most people aren't prepared to embrace. Think about it. If the human mind could reach God through intellectual effort, wouldn't the most educated people be the most enlightened? If spiritual progress came through emotional intensity, wouldn't the most passionate believers automatically experience the deepest transformation? Yet, we see brilliant theologians who lack inner peace, and devoted worshippers who remain trapped in the same mental patterns year after year. The reason is simple yet profound. You cannot think your way to Christ consciousness using human thinking. You cannot reach the infinite through finite methods. You cannot access divine wisdom through worldly intelligence. Has this ever happened to you? You pray for peace, but your mind remains anxious. You affirm abundance, but experience lack. You seek healing, but symptoms persist. This isn't because spiritual principles don't work. It's because you're trying to operate divine laws through human consciousness. What we're about to explore together will challenge everything you think you know about spiritual practice. We're going to examine why true Christ consciousness requires the death of your current way of thinking, and why this death isn't punishment but liberation. This death I'm talking about isn't metaphorical. It's the most real transformation you'll ever experience. Every spiritual breakthrough requires the complete dismantling of how you currently process reality. Think about a caterpillar entering the cocoon. It doesn't just grow wings and keep its caterpillar mindset. The entire structure dissolves, becomes liquid, and reorganizes into something completely different. This is exactly what happens when you begin thinking like Christ. The hidden truth that most people miss is that Christ consciousness isn't an addition to your current way of thinking. It's a total replacement. You can't upgrade human thinking to divine thinking. You can't patch spiritual insights onto worldly perspectives. The old operating system has to be completely uninstalled before the new one can function properly. This is why so many people struggle with spiritual practice. They're trying to run divine software on human hardware and wonder why everything glitches. Here's where it gets fascinating. The moment you truly understand this death and rebirth process, you realize that what you've been calling reality is actually just interpretation. Right now, You're looking at your life through the lens of appearances, making decisions based on what your senses tell you, forming judgments from surface-level information. But Christ consciousness operates from an entirely different vantage point. When you think like Christ, you don't deny what you see. You deny its authority over your inner state. There's a massive difference. If you lose your job, human thinking says, I'm in crisis, I'm financially insecure, my future is uncertain. Christ thinking acknowledges the situation, but interprets it through God's law. This apparent setback is redirection towards something better aligned with my divine purpose. Same facts, completely different interpretation, radically different emotional and mental impact. This shift in perception isn't positive thinking or wishful delusion. It's recognizing that every external circumstance is actually the shadow cast by your internal beliefs. When you change the belief system, the shadow automatically changes. But here's the challenge. Your ego mind will resist this transformation with everything it has, because ego literally means edging God out. It survives by maintaining the illusion that you are separate from your source, that you're at the mercy of circumstances, that life happens to you rather than through you. The journey from human consciousness to Christ consciousness requires radical mental discipline. Every thought becomes a choice point. Every emotional reaction becomes an opportunity to practice seeing beyond appearances. Every challenging situation becomes training ground for interpreting life through divine law rather than human logic. Consider how different your life would be if you consistently interpreted every experience through the lens of divine law rather than human appearances. Relationships that seem broken would be seen as opportunities for deeper understanding. Financial challenges would be recognized as invitations to trust divine provision. Health issues would be approached as calls for mental and spiritual alignment rather than just physical intervention. Write in the comments, I'm ready for this transformation, if you're feeling called to explore this deeper level of spiritual practice. This brings us to a revelation that will completely shift your understanding of what spiritual development actually means. When most people think about following Christ, they immediately default to imitation, trying to copy his actions, mimic his words, recreate his behaviors from 2,000 years ago. But this approach fundamentally misses the point and keeps you trapped in surface-level spirituality. The Christ mind doesn't operate through imitation, because imitation is still human consciousness trying to reach divine consciousness through effort. It's like trying to become a master pianist by watching YouTube videos of concert performances without ever touching the keys yourself. You might learn the movements, memorize the sequences, even fool some people with your performance, but you haven't developed the internal capacity that creates the music. Here's the hidden truth behind authentic spiritual transformation. Christ consciousness isn't something you develop or achieve, it's something you uncover. Paul made this crystal clear when he said, we have the mind of Christ, not we will have, or we might develop, or we should aspire to have. Present tense, right now, already within you. This changes everything about how you approach your spiritual journey. Instead of striving to become something you're not, you're remembering what you already are. Instead of adding spiritual practices to your human personality, you're removing the mental barriers that obscure your divine nature. The difference in approach creates a completely different energy, a different relationship with the process, and ultimately, different results. The Christ mind thinks from cause, never from effect. This is perhaps the most revolutionary concept in all of spiritual teaching, and it's also the most misunderstood. When human consciousness encounters a problem, it immediately focuses on the problem, analyzing it, fighting it, trying to solve it at the level of the problem itself. But cause-level thinking recognizes that every external condition is simply the manifestation of an internal belief system. Think about how radically this shifts your entire approach to life's challenges. Instead of asking, how do I fix this situation? The Christ mind asks, what belief within me is creating this experience? Instead of, why is this happening to me? It becomes, what is this revealing about my current level of consciousness? This isn't blame or self-criticism. It's empowerment through recognition of your creative authority. Most people live their entire lives reacting to effects while remaining completely unconscious of the causes they're generating. They wonder why the same patterns keep repeating, why different circumstances produce familiar emotional responses, why external changes don't seem to create lasting internal peace. The answer lies in understanding that you can't solve an effect-level problem with effect-level solutions. You have to go upstream to the source. But here's where most spiritual seekers get stuck. They intellectually understand this concept, but continue operating from the old mindset, because activating the Christ mind requires what Paul called renouncing the old mind. This isn't a one-time decision, but a moment-by-moment choice to reject thought patterns that belong to effect-based consciousness and embrace the authority of cause-level thinking. The impact of this shift cannot be overstated. When you truly begin thinking from cause rather than effect, you stop being a victim of circumstances and start recognizing yourself as a co-creator of your experience. Problems become opportunities for deeper self-discovery. Challenges become invitations to expand your consciousness. External events become feedback about your internal state rather than random occurrences you have to endure. This is why spiritual transformation feels so different from personal development or self-improvement. You're not upgrading your human capabilities. You're accessing an entirely different operating system that was always available, but had been buried under layers of conditioned thinking. What becomes immediately clear when you start observing your own thought patterns is how completely enslaved the human mind is to external circumstances. We live in a reactive bubble, constantly responding to whatever appears before us. Good news makes us happy, bad news makes us anxious, unexpected events throw us into chaos, and familiar situations trigger the same emotional responses we've been running for years. This automatic reaction system is what keeps most people trapped in cycles they can't seem to break. The human mind operates like a sophisticated computer program that's been coded with responses based on past experiences, cultural conditioning, and survival instincts. When certain stimuli appear, specific programs run. It happens so quickly and so automatically that we mistake these reactions for our true selves. But here's where the journey gets really interesting. The Christ mind operates from a completely different paradigm. Instead of reacting to what appears, it responds from what it knows to be true. Instead of judging circumstances based on surface appearances, it affirms the underlying spiritual reality that never changes. This isn't denial of what's happening. It's recognition of what's more true than what's happening. Think about how this plays out in practical situations. Your bank account shows a low balance. The human mind immediately triggers financial anxiety, starts calculating worst-case scenarios, begins emergency planning mode. The Christ mind acknowledges the numbers, but responds from the truth that divine supply is infinite, and that this apparent lack is simply information about current belief patterns, not a statement about ultimate reality. This shift from reaction to response is one of the most profound transformations you can experience. Reactions are automatic, unconscious, and usually based on fear. Responses are conscious, deliberate, and rooted in spiritual understanding. When you learn to pause between stimulus and response, you create space for the Christ mind to operate. But there's an even deeper revelation here that most people miss entirely. The power isn't in thinking about spiritual truths. The power is in the thinking itself when it's aligned with divine principle. Most people approach spiritual practice like they're trying to convince God of something, as if their prayers and affirmations need to be powerful enough to get God's attention or persuasive enough to change divine will. This completely misses the mechanics of how consciousness actually creates reality. When the Christ mind thinks a thought, that thought doesn't need to acquire power from somewhere else. It is power. It's not separate from the creative force of the universe. It is the creative force expressing through individual consciousness. This is why Jesus could speak with such authority. His thoughts weren't requests hoping for divine approval. They were divine will in action. The hidden truth behind manifestation is that when your thinking is perfectly aligned with the first cause, there's no gap between thought and manifestation. The delay that most people experience between desire and fulfillment exists because human thinking is conflicted, fearful, and disconnected from its source. But when consciousness operates from complete alignment with divine principle, thought and creation happen simultaneously. This explains why some people seem to effortlessly attract what they need, while others struggle despite knowing all the spiritual techniques. It's not about technique, it's about the level of consciousness from which you're operating. The Christ mind doesn't use spiritual laws. It is spiritual law expressing through human consciousness. Most spiritual teaching focuses on what to think, but the real transformation happens when you understand how to think. The quality of consciousness behind your thoughts determines their creative power, not the content of the thoughts themselves. Write in the comments, "My thoughts are creative power," if you're beginning to recognize this deeper level of spiritual authority within yourself. This distinction between thoughts that carry spiritual authority and thoughts that are destined to fail is absolutely crucial for anyone serious about spiritual transformation. Most people live their entire lives generating brilliant ideas from ego consciousness and then wonder why those ideas either never manifest or create temporary success, followed by inevitable collapse. Here's what happens behind the scenes of consciousness. When a thought originates from the Christ mind within you, it carries the full backing of universal law. It doesn't matter if the thought seems simple or unremarkable to human logic. It doesn't matter if other people don't understand it or even oppose it. That thought has been generated from perfect alignment with divine principle, which means it has access to infinite intelligence, perfect timing, and all necessary resources for its manifestation. But when a thought comes from ego consciousness, even if it's sophisticated, well-researched, and appears to make perfect logical sense, it's operating from separation and limitation. The ego mind, no matter how clever, is fundamentally disconnected from its source. It's trying to create from a place of perceived scarcity, working within the boundaries of what seems possible based on past experience and external circumstances. The fascinating thing is that you can actually feel the difference between these two types of thoughts when you become sensitive to the energy behind them. Ego-generated ideas often come with a sense of strain, urgency, or anxiety about outcome. There's usually a component of trying to prove something, compete with someone, or compensate for some perceived inadequacy. Even when these thoughts lead to temporary success, there's an underlying anxiety about whether it will last. Thoughts from the Christ mind, on the other hand, arise with a quality of peace and certainty. There's no desperation behind them, no need to force outcomes, no anxiety about timing. They often come as gentle nudges or sudden clarity rather than mental effort. And here's the remarkable thing: when you follow these inner promptings, doors open in ways that couldn't have been planned or predicted by human reasoning. This brings us to perhaps the most liberating understanding in all of spiritual practice. You don't need to develop or create the Christ mind. You're not trying to become something you're not. The divine consciousness that creates worlds is already present within you as your deepest identity. What you're actually doing is excavation work, removing the layers of false thinking that have accumulated over years of conditioning. Think of it like clearing debris from a natural spring. The spring doesn't need to be created. It already exists and is constantly flowing. But if you pile rocks, leaves, and mud over it, the water can't flow freely. Remove the debris, and the pure water immediately begins to flow again. Your consciousness works exactly the same way. The mental debris that blocks the expression of Christ consciousness includes all the thoughts that contradict your divine nature. Thoughts of unworthiness, limitation, separation, fear, and inadequacy are like foreign objects that don't belong in spiritual consciousness. They weren't part of your original design, and they have no permanent place in your mind. But here's where most people get stuck in their spiritual journey. They try to fight against these false thoughts or suppress them through willpower. This approach actually strengthens the debris because you're giving it attention and energy. The more effective approach is simply replacing false thoughts with true ones, consistently and persistently, until the false patterns lose their hold. Every moment presents you with a choice point. You can think from the Christ mind or from human conditioning. You can respond from divine authority or react from learned limitations. These decisions, made moment by moment, gradually clear the mental debris and allow your authentic spiritual nature to shine through more clearly. The profound shift that occurs when you consistently make these moment-by-moment choices reveals something extraordinary about how divine consciousness actually operates. Most people approach their spiritual goals from a place of lack, thinking about what they want to achieve, focusing on the gap between where they are and where they want to be. But this approach actually reinforces the very limitation you're trying to overcome. Christ consciousness operates from a completely different foundation. It thinks from the place of accomplished fulfillment. This isn't positive thinking or wishful visualization. It's recognition that in the realm of divine possibility, everything already exists in perfect completion. Your role isn't to create what doesn't exist, but to align your thinking with what is eternally true. Consider how radically this changes your entire approach to prayer, manifestation, and spiritual practice. Instead of asking for what you need, you give thanks for what is already provided. Instead of hoping for change, you acknowledge the perfection that exists beyond appearances. This gratitude isn't based on what you can see with physical eyes. It's based on absolute certainty that spiritual law is always operating perfectly. This is perhaps the most challenging aspect of spiritual thinking for the human mind to grasp, because it requires abandoning the evidence of your senses as the final authority on what's real. Everything you've been taught about reality is based on trusting what you can see, hear, touch, and measure. But spiritual thinking recognizes that these physical perceptions are actually shadows projected by consciousness, not the substance itself. Here's the hidden truth that transforms everything. What you call external facts are actually internal beliefs made visible. That challenging relationship isn't separate from your consciousness. It's reflecting back to you the patterns of thought you've been holding about connection, worthiness, and love. That financial situation isn't independent of your mental state. It's showing you the beliefs you've accepted about abundance, security, and self-worth. This revelation completely dismantles the victim mentality that keeps most people trapped in recurring patterns. When you understand that external circumstances are shadows cast by internal beliefs, you realize that changing your experience doesn't require manipulating external conditions. It requires shifting the consciousness that's projecting those conditions. But this level of spiritual thinking demands tremendous mental discipline because your conditioned mind will resist this understanding with everything it has. The ego mind survives by maintaining the illusion that you're at the mercy of circumstances, that life happens to you rather than through you, that you're a small, separate being trying to survive in a hostile universe. Breaking free from carnal judgment means developing the ability to look at any situation and say, this appearance is not the truth. This is information about my current level of consciousness, but it doesn't define my ultimate reality. This isn't denial of what's happening. It's recognition that what's happening is always changeable because it originated in changeable consciousness. The impact of this shift in perception cannot be overstated. When you stop interpreting external facts as definitive truths, you regain your creative authority. Problems become opportunities for consciousness expansion. Challenges become invitations to practice thinking from a higher level. Every difficult situation becomes a chance to demonstrate that you are the one projecting the experience, which means you're also the one who can transform it. This level of spiritual thinking requires what Emmet Fox called advanced spiritual technology, the willingness to consistently choose truth over appearance, principle over circumstance, divine law over human logic. It's not a one-time decision, but a moment-by-moment practice of mental vigilance. What's fascinating to observe is how quickly people create their own mental prisons through repetitive judgment patterns. Picture someone whose business venture doesn't succeed. The immediate carnal response is, "I'm defeated, I'm a failure, I don't have what it takes." But here's what's actually happening behind the scenes. Every time that person repeats this interpretation, they're literally programming their subconscious mind with defeat consciousness. These aren't just innocent thoughts or temporary emotional reactions. Each repetition of "I failed" becomes a mental chain link. The person isn't just describing what happened, they're creating an identity around what happened. They're taking a single external event and using it to define their entire capacity, their worth, their future possibilities. This is exactly what Emmet Fox meant by creating mental chains through repetition. The devastating impact of this pattern is that the person becomes trapped not by the external circumstance, but by their interpretation of the circumstance. The business failure becomes proof of personal inadequacy. That interpretation then influences every future decision, every new opportunity, every risk they might consider taking. They've essentially programmed themselves for continued limitation based on one event that was actually just information about what didn't work, not a verdict on who they are. But spiritual thinking approaches the exact same situation from a completely different framework. It acknowledges that the business didn't succeed. There's no denial of external facts, but it refuses to grant those facts authority over inner reality. Instead of "I'm defeated," spiritual thinking says, "This apparent setback is redirecting me towards something better, aligned with my divine purpose." This isn't positive thinking or self-deception. This is recognizing that every external experience is temporary and changeable, while your essential spiritual nature is permanent and perfect. The spiritual interpretation doesn't ignore what happened. It places what happened in the larger context of divine unfolding, where every experience serves the ultimate good. The key distinction is between acknowledging reality and surrendering to appearances. Spiritual consciousness can look directly at challenging circumstances without being intimidated by them, because it knows that appearances are always in flux, while spiritual truth is constant. This creates an entirely different emotional and mental relationship with life's ups and downs. When you consistently practice this type of thinking, something remarkable happens. You begin to see how quickly external conditions can shift when they're no longer supported by limiting interpretations. That business failure, when approached from spiritual consciousness, often becomes the catalyst for discovering more authentic ways of serving, more aligned career paths, or deeper trust in divine provision. The transformation occurs because you're no longer feeding energy into defeat patterns. Instead, you're affirming truth until the apparent circumstance yields to a higher possibility. This isn't wishful thinking. It's working with the fundamental principle that consciousness creates experience. And when consciousness changes, experience must follow. Most people do this process backwards. They wait for external circumstances to change before they're willing to change their internal interpretation. But spiritual thinking reverses this equation. You change your interpretation first, based on spiritual principle rather than external evidence, and then watch as the external world reorganizes itself to match your new level of consciousness. This level of mental discipline requires tremendous faith, not in outcomes, but in the process itself. You have to be willing to think from truth, even when appearances suggest otherwise, to maintain spiritual interpretation, even when physical evidence seems overwhelming, to affirm divine law, even when human logic argues against it. The real test of spiritual understanding comes in those moments when life hits you unexpectedly, and you have maybe 3 seconds to choose your response. This is where the rubber meets the road in consciousness work. Anyone can think spiritually when they're calm, centered, and everything is going well. But can you catch yourself in the moment when you receive that devastating phone call, when someone betrays your trust, when your security is suddenly threatened? This constant inner vigilance that's required isn't about being perfect or never having initial emotional reactions. It's about developing the awareness to pause and ask yourself a crucial question that will determine the entire trajectory of your experience. Am I about to think from flesh or spirit, from fear or principle? That simple question creates a gap between stimulus and response where transformation becomes possible. Most people live their entire lives on autopilot, automatically defaulting to conditioned responses without ever questioning whether those responses serve their highest good. Someone cuts them off in traffic, and anger immediately floods their system. They receive unexpected medical news, and fear takes control before they even process what's actually happening. The boss announces layoffs, and panic mode activates instantly. But here's what changes everything. When you develop the habit of asking that vigilance question, you create space for choice. You realize that your initial emotional reaction doesn't have to become your sustained mental position. You can acknowledge the human response while choosing to operate from spiritual principle. Take the job loss scenario. The carnal mind immediately goes into crisis mode. How will I pay my bills? What will people think? I'm too old to start over. The economy is terrible. I'll never find anything as good as this. Each of these thoughts generates fear, which creates more thoughts aligned with fear, which generates more fear. It's a downward spiral that can consume weeks or months of your life and actually block you from seeing opportunities that are trying to emerge. The spiritual mind approaches the exact same situation with a completely different framework. This apparent setback is divine redirection. God has something better aligned with my true purpose. This job ending is making space for something I couldn't have received while I was comfortable in the old position. Same external facts, radically different internal experience, completely different set of actions and decisions flowing from that mindset. But here's where it gets really practical and life-changing. When someone insults you or treats you disrespectfully, the carnal mind immediately personalizes it. They hurt me. They don't respect me. I need to defend myself or get back at them. This creates a whole drama of offense, resentment, and conflict that can poison your mental atmosphere for hours, days, or even years, depending on how deeply you hold on to it. The spiritual response is to recognize your invulnerability at the deepest level. This person's behavior reflects their internal state, not my worth. I am not what they say about me. I am what God says about me. Their words have no power to diminish my essential spiritual nature. This isn't denial of what happened or pretending it didn't hurt. It's recognition that your true identity exists at a level that cannot be touched by human opinion or behavior. The impact of consistently choosing spiritual interpretation over carnal reaction is absolutely transformative. Your entire emotional baseline shifts. You stop being jerked around by external circumstances. You develop what could be called emotional sovereignty, the ability to remain centered regardless of what's happening around you. But this level of spiritual maturity doesn't develop overnight. It requires what spiritual teachers call dying daily, the willingness to repeatedly choose truth over appearance, principle over emotion, love over fear. Every single day presents multiple opportunities to practice this vigilance, and every time you Choose the spiritual response. You strengthen that neural pathway in your consciousness. What most people don't realize is that every time they speak the words "I am," they're invoking the most sacred name in all of spiritual tradition. When Moses stood before the burning bush and asked God to reveal the divine name, the response wasn't a title or description. It was pure being itself. I am that I am. This wasn't God giving Moses information about divinity. This was God revealing the very essence of divine consciousness as eternal, present reality. The profound implications of this revelation completely transform how you understand your own identity and spiritual authority. Most people casually throw around "I am" statements without recognizing that they're literally decreeing their being into existence. When you say, "I am tired," "I am broke," "I am confused," you're not just describing temporary conditions. You're invoking the creative power of divine consciousness to manifest those states as your reality. But here's where it gets absolutely revolutionary for your spiritual journey. The same creative authority that operates when you declare limitation is available when you declare truth. I am one with divine source. I am filled with infinite wisdom. I am surrounded by divine love and protection. These aren't hopeful affirmations you're trying to make true. These are recognitions of what is already eternally true about your essential spiritual nature. This understanding completely dismantles the traditional religious paradigm that positions you as a small, separated human being trying to reach a distant God. That entire framework is backwards and keeps you trapped in limitation consciousness. The truth that transforms everything is recognizing that you're not a human trying to reach God. You are divine consciousness expressing itself through human experience. This shift in identity changes absolutely everything about how you approach life's challenges and opportunities. When you know yourself as a spiritual being temporarily wearing human experience, you stop asking and start declaring. You stop begging and start commanding. You stop hoping and start knowing. This isn't arrogance. This is recognition of your true heritage as divine offspring. Think about how radically this shifts your relationship with prayer, manifestation, and spiritual practice. Instead of approaching God as a supplicant, hoping for divine favor, you approach from the recognition that the same consciousness that creates worlds is the very essence of who you are. Instead of praying for things to change, you declare the truth that needs to be made manifest. The Son doesn't ask the Father for permission to access the family inheritance. The Son knows that everything the Father has already belongs to him. This level of spiritual authority isn't something you develop through years of spiritual practice. It's something you recognize as the truth of what you already are right now, regardless of what your external circumstances might suggest. But here's where most people get stuck in their spiritual development. They intellectually understand this concept, but continue operating from human consciousness because they're waiting to feel worthy of divine authority. They think they need to become more spiritual, more pure, more enlightened before they can access this level of consciousness. This is exactly backwards. You don't become worthy of your divine heritage. You recognize that your divine heritage is what makes transformation possible. You don't earn your spiritual authority. You acknowledge that spiritual authority is your birthright and begin operating from that recognition. The impact of this shift cannot be overstated. When you truly understand yourself as divine consciousness in human form, fear loses its grip on your decision-making. Lack consciousness dissolves because you know yourself as connected to infinite source. Relationship conflicts transform because you see everyone as expressions of the same divine essence. The most common mistake people make when learning about their divine identity is waiting to feel worthy before they're willing to claim it. They think they need to reach some level of spiritual purity, emotional stability, or moral perfection before they can honestly say, "I am the child of God." But this approach keeps them trapped in an endless cycle of trying to become worthy of what they already are. Here's the hidden mechanism behind authentic transformation that most spiritual teachers don't explain clearly enough. Your feelings don't create your reality. Your sustained thoughts create your feelings, which then create your reality. When you wait to feel worthy before affirming your divine nature, you're putting the cart before the horse. You're trying to generate the feeling from emptiness instead of generating the feeling from truth. The correct sequence is to first recognize and declare the truth about your spiritual identity, regardless of what your emotions are telling you in the moment. I am one with divine source. I am the perfect expression of God's love. I am filled with infinite wisdom and power. These aren't statements you make after you feel spiritual. These are statements that create the feeling of connection to your spiritual nature. Most people resist this approach because it feels dishonest or presumptuous. They think, but I don't feel like the child of God. I feel anxious, confused, inadequate. But here's what they're missing. Those feelings of unworthiness are themselves the very illusions that need to be dissolved through sustained recognition of truth. Every time you affirm your divine identity despite contradictory feelings, you're actually reprogramming the subconscious patterns that generate those feelings. This brings us to one of the most misunderstood concepts in all of spiritual teaching: true humility versus false humility. Most religious conditioning teaches that humility means diminishing yourself, denying your divine connection, emphasizing your flaws and limitations. I'm just a sinner. I'm not worthy. I don't deserve God's love. This type of thinking is actually spiritual pride disguised as humility, because it places your human assessment above God's declaration about who you are. True humility is recognizing and manifesting the divine image that God created you to express. When you deny your spiritual inheritance, you're not honoring God. You're contradicting God's creative intention. The false self maintains itself by declaring inadequacy and separation. I am unworthy. I am limited. I can't do this. But the true self declares divine authority. I can do all things through Christ, which strengthens me. This isn't ego inflation or spiritual arrogance. This is alignment with spiritual fact. The difference is that ego tries to make itself important through comparison with others, while divine consciousness recognizes that everyone shares the same spiritual inheritance. There's no competition in recognizing your divine nature, because divine nature is infinite and available to all. The practical impact of this understanding is profound. When you stop waiting to feel worthy and start declaring your worthiness based on spiritual principle, everything in your life begins to shift. Your decision-making changes because you're no longer operating from scarcity consciousness. Your relationships transform because you're no longer seeking validation from others to feel complete. Your approach to challenges shifts because you're drawing from infinite resource rather than limited human capacity. But this level of spiritual authority requires tremendous mental discipline, because the world around you will constantly invite you back into limitation consciousness. People will project their own unworthiness onto you. Circumstances will seem to contradict your divine nature. Your own emotions will sometimes argue against your spiritual declarations. This is where the real work begins. Learning to maintain your recognition of divine identity regardless of external evidence or internal resistance. It's learning to live from cause rather than effect, from truth rather than appearance, from principle rather than circumstance. This brings us to perhaps the most practical and immediately applicable aspect of Christ consciousness, understanding that thought mastery is the foundation of all spiritual authority. There's a universal law operating in your life right now that most people are completely unconscious of, yet it's creating their entire experience moment by moment, day by day, year by year. Every single experience you've ever had, Every relationship, every financial situation, every health condition, every success and every failure has resulted from a thought that you maintained with faith. This isn't spiritual theory or religious philosophy. This is a precise law that operates as consistently as gravity, requiring only application, not belief. You don't have to understand electricity to flip a switch and turn on a light. And you don't have to understand metaphysics to use the creative power of your consciousness. The profound implications of this understanding completely revolutionize how you approach every aspect of your life. Most people live as passive recipients of experience, thinking that life happens to them and their role is simply to react as best they can. But when you understand that your sustained thoughts are literally creating your experience, you realize that you're not a victim of circumstances. You're the author of your circumstances. But here's where most people get confused about the mechanics of manifestation. They think that having a positive thought once or twice should immediately change their external conditions. When it doesn't, they conclude that spiritual principles don't work, or that they're doing something wrong. What they're missing is the crucial element of sustained focus combined with faith. The hidden truth behind manifestation is that most people don't actually think. They just repeat borrowed ideas and react to stimuli. Real thinking is a deliberate, conscious activity where you choose what idea to maintain in your mind and then hold that idea without distraction, without doubt, without wavering. This kind of thinking is incredibly rare because it requires mental discipline that most people have never developed. Consider how your mind typically operates throughout the day. A thought appears, you follow it for a few seconds, then another thought captures your attention. Then you get distracted by something external. Then an emotion pulls you in a different direction. Then you remember something from the past. Then you worry about something in the future. This scattered, reactive mental activity isn't thinking. It's mental chaos masquerading as consciousness. True, thinking begins when you take deliberate control of your mental focus and sustain a chosen thought, despite all the internal and external forces trying to pull your attention elsewhere. When you can hold an idea about health, abundance, peace, or love with unwavering focus and complete faith, that thought begins to reorganize your entire experience to match its vibration. This is why Jesus could say with such authority, "It is done unto you according to your faith." He wasn't talking about religious faith or belief in doctrines. He was describing the mechanics of consciousness, that whatever you hold in mind with sustained certainty becomes your external reality through the operation of spiritual law. The challenge for most people is that they've been unconsciously maintaining thoughts of limitation, lack, and fear with tremendous faith for years or even decades. They don't realize that their constant worry about money is a form of prayer for financial struggle. Their repeated concerns about relationships are affirmations of relational discord. Their ongoing anxiety about health is meditation on illness. Breaking these unconscious patterns requires becoming aware of what you're actually thinking moment by moment, and then making deliberate choices about what thoughts deserve your sustained attention. Every thought you entertain is a vote for the kind of experience you want to create. Every idea you maintain with feeling becomes a prayer to the universe for more of that same experience. The transformation begins when you realize that you have complete authority over what thoughts you choose to nurture and which ones you choose to dismiss. This conscious choice of thoughts becomes most powerful when you understand the precise structure of affirmative prayer, which is fundamentally different from the pleading, begging, and desperate requesting that most people think of as prayer. Affirmative prayer isn't asking God for something. It's declaring spiritual truth with such certainty that the law of manifestation has no choice but to respond. The structure is deceptively simple, yet incredibly powerful when applied with understanding. You begin by recognizing God as total presence, not a distant deity who might or might not respond to your requests, but as the very consciousness through which you're thinking and the very life force that's animating your being. This recognition immediately shifts you out of separation consciousness and into unity consciousness. From this foundation of recognizing divine presence as your very essence, you then affirm the truth about whatever situation you're addressing. Instead of describing the problem or explaining why you need help, you declare the spiritual reality that exists beyond appearances. If you're dealing with financial challenges, you don't pray about being broke. You affirm the truth of infinite divine provision flowing through your life right now. Then comes the crucial element that most people miss entirely. You declare the manifestation as already accomplished, not as something you hope will happen in the future, but as something that is already complete in spiritual reality and is now making itself visible in physical form. This isn't wishful thinking. This is recognition that everything already exists in divine mind, and your role is to align your consciousness with what's already perfect and complete. The final component is gratitude, but not the desperate thankfulness of someone hoping their request will be granted. This is the natural gratitude that flows from certainty, the same way you'd thank someone who hands you something you asked for. You give thanks because you know with absolute conviction that spiritual law is precise, reliable, and already operating. What makes this approach so radically different from typical prayer is that it's based on faith rather than emotion. Most people pray from desperation, fear, or urgent need, thinking that the intensity of their emotion will somehow convince God to intervene. But emotion is actually the vibration of doubt disguised as spiritual fervor. When you're desperate for something to change, you're affirming that it hasn't changed yet. True faith operates from an entirely different frequency. Faith is inner certainty that exists independent of external evidence. It's not believing despite contradictory appearances. It's knowing from a level of consciousness that transcends appearances altogether. This kind of faith doesn't fluctuate based on circumstances because it's rooted in understanding of how consciousness creates reality. This distinction between faith and emotion explains why some people seem to manifest easily while others struggle despite knowing all the spiritual techniques. The person operating from faith thinks from the end result, feels from the accomplished goal, and acts from the certainty of divine law. The person operating from emotion thinks from the current problem, feels from the existing lack, and acts from desperation to change what is. The impact of this shift cannot be overstated. When you pray from faith rather than emotion, you're not trying to convince God of anything. You're aligning your consciousness with what God has already established as spiritual fact. You're not hoping for divine intervention. You're recognizing divine presence as the very medium through which your thoughts become manifest. This level of spiritual authority requires letting go of the need to see immediate external confirmation of your prayers. Faith operates from the inside out, beginning with inner knowing that gradually becomes outer demonstration. Emotion operates from the outside in, requiring external changes before it can believe internally. Write in the comments, "I pray from faith, not emotion," if you're ready to shift from desperate requesting to confident declaring in your spiritual practice. This challenge of maintaining spiritual consciousness when external evidence seems overwhelming brings us to perhaps the most advanced aspect of Christ-like thinking, developing what could be called divine vision. Most people see the world through the filter of physical senses and human logic, interpreting everything that happens as either good or bad based on immediate appearances. But Christ's vision operates from an entirely different vantage point. When you begin to see like God sees, you're looking beyond the temporary forms and circumstances to recognize the underlying spiritual reality that never changes. This doesn't mean denying what's happening on the physical plane. It means understanding that what's happening physically is always subordinate to what's true spiritually. The presence of good exists everywhere, all the time, but it requires trained spiritual perception to recognize it when external appearances suggest otherwise. Consider how radically this transforms your experience of challenging situations. Most people look at illness and see only disease, limitation, and threat. Divine vision looks at the same situation and sees an opportunity for deeper trust, a call to remember spiritual wholeness, a chance to demonstrate that identity exists beyond physical form. Same situation, completely different. Interpretation, entirely different emotional and mental response. This isn't positive thinking or trying to put a spiritual spin on difficult circumstances. This is recognizing that every experience, regardless of how it appears initially, contains within it the seed of greater good when approached from spiritual consciousness. The hidden truth is that what we call problems are often divine redirection disguised as difficulty. But here's what prevents most people from developing this level of spiritual vision: fear. And fear, when you understand its true nature, is always a signal that you've temporarily lost connection with spiritual principle. Fear never arises from actual danger. It arises from the belief that you're separate from your source, that something exists outside divine will that can ultimately harm you. This revelation about the nature of fear changes everything about how you relate to life's uncertainties. When you understand that fear is essentially a belief in separation, you realize that the antidote to fear isn't courage in the human sense. It's remembering your connection to the principle that governs everything. Nothing can touch the divine essence of who you are unless you give it permission through your own thinking. Think about how this understanding impacts your daily decision-making process. When you're considering a new opportunity, a relationship change, a career move, or any significant life decision, fear often shows up to warn you about potential negative outcomes. But when you recognize fear as disconnection from principle rather than legitimate guidance, you can ask a different question. Is this fear coming from genuine spiritual discernment or from the illusion of separation? Most of the limitations people accept in their lives aren't based on actual spiritual guidance. They're based on fear, disguised as wisdom. I'm too old to start over. I can't afford to take that risk. What if it doesn't work out? These concerns seem practical and reasonable, but they're actually expressions of separation consciousness that keep you trapped in circumstances that no longer serve your growth. Divine vision sees through these fear-based limitations to recognize the unlimited possibilities that exist when you're aligned with spiritual principle. This doesn't mean being reckless or ignoring practical considerations, but it means making decisions from connection rather than separation, from possibility rather than limitation, from love rather than fear. The transformation of your entire life experience becomes possible when you consistently choose to see from this elevated perspective. Relationships that seemed impossible to heal suddenly show potential for restoration. Financial situations that appeared hopeless reveal unexpected solutions. Health challenges that felt overwhelming become opportunities for deeper spiritual understanding. When someone is behaving in ways that trigger your frustration, anger, or hurt, feelings, the immediate human response is to focus on their behavior and judge it as wrong, inappropriate, or unacceptable. But remember, this is exactly the kind of carnal judgment that keeps you trapped in reactive consciousness. The spiritual approach is to look beyond the behavior to see what's actually happening at a deeper level. That person who's being difficult, argumentative, or seemingly impossible to deal with is actually expressing their own disconnection from peace. Their behavior isn't really about you. It's a projection of their internal state. When you can see conflict as fear-based appearance rather than ultimate truth, You free yourself from taking their actions personally and create space for an entirely different kind of response. This shift in perception allows you to declare internally, this isn't truth. This person's behavior is coming from pain, fear, or confusion, not from their divine nature. I see peace where they see struggle. I see unity where they see division. I see their Christ self, even when they can't see it themselves. This isn't denial of their behavior, but recognition that their behavior doesn't define their essential spiritual identity. The transformative power of this approach is remarkable. When you consistently refuse to engage with someone's negativity at the level of negativity, something in the dynamic begins to shift. Your peaceful response to their agitation often dissolves the energy that was fueling their reactive state. Not always immediately, but over time, people respond to the consciousness you bring to interactions more than to your words or actions. But perhaps even more important than how this affects your relationships is how it affects your own mental and emotional state. When you practice seeing divine essence in difficult people, you're training your consciousness to operate from love rather than fear, from understanding rather than judgment, from unity rather than separation. This becomes your default response pattern, which transforms every area of your life. This principle extends far beyond interpersonal relationships to how you approach any challenging or uncertain situation. One of the most destructive mental habits that keeps people trapped in limitation consciousness is negative anticipation, constantly imagining worst-case scenarios and then living as if those imaginary futures are already real. The human mind has this peculiar tendency to rehearse problems that don't exist, yet creating anxiety about situations that may never happen. Planning for difficulties that are often products of fearful imagination rather than actual possibilities. This mental pattern is the opposite of Christ consciousness, which operates from expectation of good rather than anticipation of evil. Breaking the worry habit requires conscious intervention every time your mind starts spiraling into what-if scenarios. Instead of following those fear-based thoughts to their logical conclusion, you interrupt the pattern with affirmations of trust. God governs this situation completely. Divine intelligence is orchestrating everything for the highest good. There's nothing to fear because I'm connected to infinite love and wisdom. This isn't denial of practical planning or reasonable preparation. This is refusing to energize imaginary problems with fearful thinking. There's a huge difference between taking appropriate action based on current circumstances and creating internal stress about situations that exist only in your worried imagination. The impact of this shift cannot be overstated. When you train your mind to expect divine good rather than anticipated problems, you actually become available to solutions, opportunities, and resources that worry consciousness completely overlooks. This practice of expecting divine good rather than anticipating problems naturally leads us into what might be the most profound and misunderstood spiritual practice of all: authentic forgiveness. Most people think of forgiveness as either an emotional process of letting go or a moral obligation to excuse someone's harmful behavior. But true forgiveness from Christ consciousness is actually a precise mental operation that has nothing to do with emotions and everything to do with recognizing truth. Here's the hidden mechanism behind genuine forgiveness that completely transforms how you approach healing from past hurts. What's actually holding you captive isn't what someone did to you, it's what you believed about what they did. The experience happened, but your interpretation of that experience is what created the ongoing pain, resentment, or sense of victimization that continues to affect your life. Think about two people who go through identical experiences. Say, both have their business partnerships end badly with financial losses and betrayed trust. One person processes this experience and moves forward, using the lessons learned to create better boundaries and more successful relationships. The other person remains bitter, suspicious, and afraid to trust anyone again for years or even decades. Same external experience, completely different internal interpretations, radically different long-term impacts. The person who heals quickly recognizes that what happened was information about that particular situation and relationship, not a verdict about human nature or their own worth. The person who remains stuck creates a belief system around the experience. People can't be trusted. I'm not a good judge of character. Success always comes with betrayal. These interpretations become mental prisons that limit every future decision and relationship. True forgiveness is the conscious dissolution of these error thoughts that have been masquerading as truth in your mind. It's not about deciding that what happened was okay, or pretending it didn't hurt, or excusing inappropriate behavior. It's about recognizing that your interpretation of what happened has been creating ongoing suffering and choosing to see the situation from a higher perspective that restores your freedom. But here's where forgiveness becomes even more profound and personally beneficial. Because of the way consciousness works, whatever you consistently think about others, your subconscious mind applies to you as well. This is why holding grudges is so destructive to your own well-being. Not because you're being spiritually bad, but because you're literally programming your mind with the very qualities you're condemning in others. When you think repeatedly about someone being untrustworthy, selfish, or harmful, your subconscious begins to expect these qualities to show up in your own life. You start attracting people who match these patterns, or you begin expressing these shadow qualities yourself. The judgment you hold against others becomes a lens through which you interpret all of your relationships and experiences. This explains why forgiveness isn't primarily about liberating the other person. It's about liberating yourself from mental patterns that are creating ongoing limitation in your life. Every grudge you hold, every person you refuse to forgive, every situation you continue to resent is like carrying around mental baggage that weighs down every new experience and relationship. The transformation that occurs when you genuinely forgive from this deeper understanding is remarkable. Relationships that seemed permanently damaged sometimes heal in ways that surprise everyone involved. But even when external relationships don't change, your internal experience shifts dramatically. You stop being triggered by certain types of people or situations because you're no longer carrying the emotional charge of unresolved resentment. More importantly, you regain access to your full creative power. When mental energy is tied up in judgment and resentment, it's not available for creating positive experiences. Forgiveness releases that energy and makes it available for manifestation, healing, and spiritual growth. This release of judgment through authentic forgiveness opens the door to perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of Christ consciousness. The ability to see others as God sees them, completely beyond their errors, mistakes, and human limitations. This isn't about excusing harmful behavior or pretending that inappropriate actions are acceptable. This is about recognizing the eternal spiritual identity that exists in every person, regardless of how obscured it might be by their current level of consciousness. When someone has hurt you, betrayed your trust, or acted in ways that seem completely contrary to love, the human mind wants to define that person by their worst moments. You start thinking of them as the person who lied to me, the one who abandoned me, or someone who can't be trusted. But this mental labeling process actually keeps you connected to the very energy you're trying to heal from. Forgiveness from Christ consciousness makes a radical declaration. What this person did doesn't alter what they are at the deepest level, and it certainly doesn't alter what you are. Their behavior was a temporary expression of their disconnection from their divine nature, not a revelation of their true spiritual identity. And more importantly, their actions have no power to diminish or damage your essential spiritual essence. This perspective completely transforms how you process painful experiences. Instead of rehearsing the story of what happened over and over, which keeps the emotional wound fresh and active, you consciously choose to replace the repetitive pain patterns with truth affirmations that restore your connection to spiritual reality. Here's how this works practically. If you're dealing with the pain of rejection, whether in a relationship, job, or social situation, the human mind wants to replay all the evidence of why you weren't chosen, accepted, or valued. But this mental rehearsal actually reinforces rejection consciousness and attracts more experiences of feeling unwanted or inadequate. The Christ consciousness approach is to interrupt these pain patterns and replace them with spiritual truth. I am God's full acceptance. Divine love recognizes my worth completely. I am perfectly valued by the only opinion that matters eternally. You're not denying that the rejection happened, but you're refusing to let that temporary human experience define your permanent spiritual identity. The same principle applies to betrayal, which is often one of the most difficult experiences to heal from spiritually. When someone breaks your trust, the natural response is to protect yourself by becoming suspicious, guarded, and skeptical of future relationships. But this defensive stance actually closes you off from the very connections that could bring healing and joy. Instead of building walls around your heart, Christ consciousness declares, I am divine. Fidelity in every relationship. The loyalty and trustworthiness I seek is already within me and naturally attracts the same qualities in others. What happened to me was about their level of consciousness, not about my worthiness of faithful love. This process of replacing pain with truth isn't emotional work, it's mental discipline. You're literally reprogramming your subconscious mind to operate from spiritual fact rather than human interpretation. Every time you choose truth over the repetitive pain story, you're weakening the neural pathways of victimhood and strengthening the consciousness of spiritual invulnerability. The transformation that occurs through this practice is profound. You stop being defined by what happened to you and start being defined by how you choose to interpret and respond to what happened. Your sense of identity shifts from someone who was hurt to someone who knows their divine worth, regardless of human treatment. This level of spiritual maturity naturally leads to a deeper understanding of what authentic spiritual identity actually means when it's not filtered through human roles, expectations, or societal definitions. This recognition of your unshakable spiritual worth naturally leads to one of the most liberating discoveries in all of spiritual development, understanding the difference between your true individuality and the false personality you've been taught to identify with. Most people spend their entire lives trying to improve, fix, or perfect their personality, not realizing that personality is actually a collection of learned responses, cultural conditioning, and survival mechanisms that have nothing to do with their authentic spiritual nature. Your true individuality isn't your temperament, your behavioral patterns, your professional achievements, or the roles you play in relationships. Your true individuality is the unique, divine idea that God had when thinking you into existence. You are literally a specific thought in the mind of the infinite, designed to express a particular combination of divine attributes that has never existed before and will never be duplicated. This understanding completely revolutionizes how you approach personal growth and spiritual development. Instead of trying to become someone you're not, you begin discovering who you already are at the deepest level. Instead of copying other people's spiritual expressions or trying to fit into predetermined religious templates, you start uncovering your own authentic way of manifesting divine consciousness. Here's what most people miss about spiritual uniqueness. God doesn't create repetitions. Every snowflake is different, every fingerprint is unique, every sunset has its own particular beauty. This same principle of infinite variety applies to spiritual expression. You're not here to be a carbon copy of Jesus, Buddha, or any other spiritual figure. You're here to be the first and only you that has ever existed. This means you have something to offer the world that no one else can provide. There's a specific combination of love, wisdom, creativity, healing, teaching, or service that can only come through your individual consciousness when it's aligned with divine source. This isn't ego speaking. This is recognition of how divine creativity works through infinite individual expressions. The tragedy is that most people never discover their unique spiritual gift because they're too busy trying to conform to what others expect, comparing themselves to other people's achievements, or attempting to fulfill roles that were never meant for them. They spend decades developing talents that feel forced, pursuing careers that drain their energy, or maintaining relationships that require them to suppress their authentic nature. But when you begin to understand yourself as a divine idea seeking expression rather than a human personality trying to improve itself, everything shifts. You start paying attention to what brings you genuine joy, what activities make you lose track of time, what forms of service feel natural and effortless. These aren't just hobbies or preferences, they're clues to your spiritual design. Your authentic spiritual expression isn't something you have to create from nothing. It's something you uncover by removing the layers of conditioning that have been covering your true nature. Every time you act from genuine inspiration rather than external pressure, every time you choose authenticity over approval, every time you follow your inner knowing rather than conventional wisdom, you're allowing your divine individuality to emerge more clearly. This process requires tremendous courage because it often means disappointing people who have become comfortable with the false version of yourself that you've been presenting. It might mean changing careers, ending relationships that require you to be someone you're not, or pursuing directions that don't make logical sense to others, but feel absolutely right to your soul. The beautiful paradox is that when you finally stop trying to be what others want and start being who God created you to be, you actually serve the world at a much higher level. Your authentic expression always contributes something valuable to the collective human experience, even when that contribution doesn't look like traditional success or recognition. This discovery of your unique divine expression through recognizing what brings you genuine joy and natural excellence reveals something profound about how spiritual guidance actually works. When you're aligned with your authentic spiritual function, everything flows with a quality of ease and inspiration that's completely different from forced effort or willpower. This is one of the most reliable ways to distinguish between genuine spiritual direction and the ego's clever imitations. The ego mind loves to create elaborate spiritual plans, complex goals, and ambitious projects that look impressive but feel heavy and draining to sustain. Ego-driven activity often involves comparison with others, need for external validation, or underlying anxiety about outcomes. There's usually an element of proving something, achieving recognition, or compensating for some perceived inadequacy. But when you're operating from your authentic spiritual design, there's a quality of natural flow and joyful expression that needs no external motivation. You find yourself drawn to certain activities not because you should do them or because they'll bring you success, but because they feel like natural extensions of who you are. This isn't laziness or lack of discipline, it's alignment with divine creativity expressing through your individual consciousness. Here's where spiritual discernment becomes crucial. The path of authentic expression often leads you in directions that don't make logical sense to conventional thinking. Your spiritual function might call you to serve in ways that seem impractical, pursue interests that appear unrealistic, or develop gifts that don't have obvious market value. This is where you need to trust divine intelligence over human logic. But as you begin living more authentically and following genuine spiritual guidance, you'll inevitably encounter resistance, both from your own conditioned thinking and from the world around you. This resistance often manifests as what appears to be obstacles, setbacks, opposition, or even spiritual attack. Understanding how to interpret these challenging experiences is essential for maintaining your spiritual direction. This brings us to one of the most liberating yet difficult concepts in advanced spiritual thinking, recognizing that what we call evil, opposition, or spiritual darkness has no actual substance or divine origin. This doesn't mean that harmful experiences don't occur or that people don't sometimes act from destructive consciousness. It means that these experiences, no matter how real they seem, are actually illusions that can be dissolved through proper understanding of spiritual truth. Evil, in its deepest sense, is simply the absence of divine consciousness, like darkness is the absence of light. It has no independent existence, no creative power of its own, no ability to perpetuate itself without being fed by human belief and attention. When you understand this principle, your entire approach to dealing with negativity, opposition, and challenging circumstances transforms completely. Instead of fighting against what appears to be working against you, you begin to withdraw the mental energy that was sustaining those negative patterns. Instead of giving power to opposition by focusing on it, resisting it, or trying to overcome it, you simply turn your attention to truth and let the illusion dissolve through lack of support. This principle applies to everything from personal challenges like addiction, depression, or chronic illness, to larger issues like conflict, injustice, or apparent evil in the world. None of these conditions have permanent reality or divine sanction. They exist only as long as consciousness continues to believe in them and feed them with attention, emotion, and mental energy. The transformation that occurs when you truly understand this principle is remarkable. You stop being intimidated by appearances of evil or opposition because you recognize them as temporary illusions that have no real power over spiritual consciousness. This understanding of error as illusion becomes even more profound when you recognize that most of humanity is currently living under a form of collective mental hypnosis. From birth, we're conditioned to accept certain beliefs as unquestionable facts. That pain is natural, conflict is inevitable, limitation is realistic, and evil is a powerful force that must be constantly fought against. These shared beliefs create massive mental fields that make error appear absolutely real and undeniable. Think about how this collective programming operates in practical ways. When you turn on the news, browse social media, or engage in typical conversations, you're constantly being exposed to fear-based narratives about scarcity, danger, division, and hopelessness. These aren't just isolated opinions. They're part of a collective consciousness that has been building momentum for generations, creating what feels like an overwhelming tide of negative evidence. This mental environment makes it incredibly challenging to maintain spiritual perspective because you're swimming against the current of mass consciousness. When everyone around you is discussing economic collapse, health crises, relationship failures, and global conflicts as inevitable realities, it takes tremendous spiritual discipline to remember that these appearances, no matter how widely accepted, are still temporary illusions that can be transformed through conscious application of spiritual principle. But here's what most people don't understand about breaking free from this collective hypnosis. It's not enough to simply think positively or try to maintain an optimistic attitude while surrounded by negativity. Positive thinking is still human thinking. It's just the pleasant side of the same consciousness that creates negative thinking. What's needed is something entirely different: correct thinking from spiritual principle. Metaphysical treatment, as Emmet Fox taught it, isn't about fighting against error or trying to convince yourself that problems don't exist. It's about replacing error consciousness with truth consciousness through sustained, unwavering affirmation of spiritual fact. This isn't discussion or analysis of the problem. It's direct declaration of divine reality that gradually dissolves the mental patterns supporting the problem. Here's how this works practically. If you're dealing with financial stress, human consciousness wants to analyze the situation, worry about solutions, and discuss all the reasons why money is scarce. Metaphysical treatment takes a completely different approach. Divine substance is the only reality. Infinite supply flows through my life now. God's abundance manifests perfectly in every area of my experience. These aren't statements you make hoping they'll become true. These are recognitions of what is eternally true, regardless of current appearances. The power of this approach lies in its directness and certainty. When you consistently declare spiritual truth without wavering, doubt, or discussion of the contrary evidence, you're literally reprogramming your consciousness at the deepest level. You're withdrawing your belief from limitation patterns and investing your mental energy in divine possibilities. This process requires what could be called holy stubbornness, the willingness to maintain spiritual declarations despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. It's refusing to be swayed by collective opinion, mass media programming, or even your own emotional reactions. It's staying anchored in principle when everything around you is fluctuating based on circumstances. The transformation that occurs through this kind of sustained metaphysical work is remarkable. You begin to develop immunity to mass consciousness programming. Fear-based news stories lose their power to disturb your peace. Other people's anxiety doesn't automatically become your anxiety. Crisis consciousness begins to slide off your mental atmosphere like water off a duck's back. More importantly, you start to hear divine guidance more clearly because your mental reception isn't being jammed by collective static. When your consciousness is clear of fear patterns and limitation beliefs, the gentle promptings of spiritual wisdom become much more distinct and trustworthy. This clear spiritual hearing naturally leads us to perhaps the most practical and immediately transformative aspect of Christ consciousness, learning to distinguish between genuine divine guidance and the countless external voices trying to influence your decisions. Most people spend their lives being pulled in different directions by family expectations, societal pressures, cultural norms, and expert opinions, never realizing that the most reliable guidance is already available within their own consciousness. True obedience to God has nothing to do with following external religious rules or conforming to moral codes imposed from outside. Divine guidance doesn't come through shoulds, musts, or obligations. It doesn't create pressure, urgency, or anxiety about outcomes. Real spiritual direction flows from the Christ consciousness within you as gentle promptings, sudden clarity, or peaceful knowing that feels completely natural and aligned with your deepest wisdom. Here's what makes divine guidance so different from human decision-making. Your logical mind wants to gather all available information, analyze pros and cons, predict potential outcomes, and make decisions based on past experience and external circumstances. This approach seems reasonable and responsible, but it's actually quite limited because it can only work with information that's already known and patterns that have already been established. Divine guidance operates from a completely different source, infinite intelligence that sees the perfect timing, connections, and possibilities that human logic could never predict or arrange. When you receive genuine spiritual direction, it often doesn't make complete sense to your rational mind initially, but it carries a quality of rightness and peace that your soul immediately recognizes. Learning to distinguish this authentic inner guidance from ego, disguised as spirituality, requires developing sensitivity to the different qualities of these two types of inner voices. Intuition has a particular signature that becomes unmistakable once you learn to recognize it. It's clear without being forceful, confident without being aggressive, directive without being controlling. There's usually a sense of timing and appropriateness that feels perfectly natural. True spiritual guidance never proposes actions that would harm others or create unnecessary division and conflict. It doesn't operate from fear, urgency, or the need to prove something. It doesn't compare you to others or make you feel superior or inferior to anyone. Divine direction always invites greater harmony, understanding, and authentic expression of love. The ego mind, on the other hand, often masquerades as spiritual guidance, but carries entirely different energy. Ego-driven promptings usually involve some element of getting something, proving something, avoiding something, or controlling outcomes. There's often an underlying anxiety about whether you're doing things right or missing opportunities. Ego guidance frequently creates internal pressure and makes you feel like you have to act quickly before something bad happens. Training yourself to receive divine guidance clearly requires developing what could be called spiritual receptivity, the ability to quiet all the mental noise and emotional static so you can hear the gentle voice of wisdom that's always speaking within you. This isn't about becoming passive or waiting for dramatic revelations, but about cultivating the inner stillness where spiritual intelligence can be recognized and trusted. Most people's minds are so busy with planning, worrying, analyzing, and reacting that they never create space for divine guidance to be heard clearly. But when you make regular time for silence, meditation, or contemplative prayer, you begin to notice subtle differences between thoughts that come from anxiety and thoughts that come from peace, between ideas that create pressure and ideas that create flow. The practical application of this spiritual receptivity transforms every area of your life. Career decisions become less about external success and more about authentic service. Relationship choices become less about emotional need and more about genuine compatibility and mutual growth. Financial decisions become less about fear-based security and more about trusting divine provision while taking appropriate action. This practice of daily silence and receptivity to divine guidance naturally leads to the ultimate expression of spiritual maturity, what Emmet Fox called practical Christification. This isn't about becoming more religious or adopting spiritual behaviors that look impressive to others. This is about achieving complete alignment between your thinking, speaking, and acting so that every aspect of your life becomes a consistent expression of Christ consciousness. Most people live fragmented spiritual lives where their thoughts operate from one level, their words from another level, and their actions from yet another level entirely. They might think loving thoughts during meditation, speak kindly when they're in a good mood, but act from fear, competition, or self-protection when they're under pressure. This internal inconsistency creates confusion in the subconscious mind and dramatically reduces the effectiveness of spiritual practice. True spiritual power emerges when your entire being operates from the same frequency. When your thoughts are aligned with divine principle, your words naturally express that same principle, and your actions flow from the same source of spiritual authority. This creates what could be called coherent internal vibration, where there's no conflict between what you believe, what you say, and what you do. The transformation that occurs when you achieve this level of integration is remarkable. Your presence begins to carry a quality of peace and authenticity that people can sense immediately, even when you're not speaking about spiritual topics. You stop needing to explain yourself or convince others of your worth because your entire being radiates a confidence that comes from inner alignment. But achieving this level of Christification requires tremendous honesty about the gaps between your spiritual understanding and your actual behavior. It means examining every area of your life to see where you're still operating from human consciousness disguised as spiritual practice. Are you truly speaking from love, or are you using spiritual language to manipulate outcomes? Are your actions motivated by genuine service, or are you performing good deeds to feel better about yourself? This process of alignment isn't about perfection in the human sense. It's about authenticity at the deepest level. Christ consciousness doesn't require you to be flawless, but it does require you to be honest about where you are and willing to keep aligning with truth rather than maintaining comfortable illusions about your spiritual progress. The practical application of this alignment touches every mundane aspect of daily life. How you handle disagreements with family members becomes an opportunity to practice speaking from Christ consciousness rather than defensive ego. How you respond to unexpected delays or inconveniences becomes a chance to demonstrate that your peace doesn't depend on external circumstances going according to plan. Your relationship with money, career decisions, health choices, and social interactions all become laboratories for practicing this integrated spiritual living. The goal isn't to become a perfect person who never makes mistakes, but to become someone whose default response to life comes from spiritual principle rather than human conditioning. This level of practical spirituality requires what could be called moment-by-moment vigilance, not the tense, effortful kind of vigilance that exhausts you, but the relaxed awareness that gently guides every choice back toward alignment with divine consciousness. It's learning to pause before speaking and asking, is this coming from love or fear? It's checking your motivations before acting and choosing service over self-interest. The beautiful paradox is that as you become more consistently Christified in your daily expression, spiritual practice becomes effortless rather than effortful. You're no longer trying to be spiritual, you're simply being yourself when yourself is aligned with divine truth. This understanding of complete alignment brings us to perhaps the most crucial insight about authentic spiritual transformation, recognizing that Christification isn't a destination you reach once and maintain forever, but a daily renewed choice that must be made fresh each morning and sustained throughout every interaction and decision. Most people approach spiritual development like they're trying to graduate from a program. They think that once they understand certain principles, master specific practices, or reach particular levels of consciousness, they'll have arrived spiritually and can coast on their achievements. But this mindset actually becomes one of the greatest obstacles to genuine spiritual progress because it treats Christ consciousness like a human accomplishment rather than a divine grace that must be actively received moment by moment. The hidden truth that transforms everything is recognizing that you're not trying to become a better person who eventually develops Christ-like qualities. You're learning to step aside so that the Christ consciousness that already exists within you can express itself without obstruction from your human personality, conditioning, and habitual ways of thinking. This shift in understanding completely changes your relationship with spiritual practice. Instead of effortful striving to improve yourself, you're practicing the art of allowing divine nature to flow through you naturally. Instead of accumulating spiritual knowledge and techniques, you're learning to dissolve the mental barriers that prevent your authentic spiritual essence from expressing clearly. But here's where sincere spiritual students often encounter unexpected challenges. The very dedication that makes someone serious about spiritual growth can become a subtle form of spiritual pride if not carefully watched. The ego mind is incredibly clever at co-opting spiritual progress and turning it into another form of personal achievement, comparison with others, or sense of superiority. This is why daily renewal is so essential. Every morning, you must consciously choose to surrender your human agenda to divine will, to remember that any spiritual insight or peaceful experience you've had belongs to God, working through you, not to your personal spiritual accomplishments. Each day requires fresh humility, renewed willingness to be guided, and continuous surrender of the need to control outcomes. The practical impact of this daily renewal approach is profound. You stop expecting yourself to maintain perfect spiritual behavior all the time, which actually allows for more authentic spiritual expression. You develop patience with your own learning process while maintaining commitment to growth. You become less concerned with how others perceive your spiritual progress and more focused on genuine alignment with divine truth. If you've stayed with me through this entire exploration of thinking like Christ, you've already demonstrated something remarkable: the willingness to go deeper than surface-level spirituality and engage with teachings that demand genuine transformation, rather than just inspiration. That kind of commitment to authentic spiritual growth is rare, and it tells me you're serious about actually applying these principles rather than just collecting spiritual information. This is exactly the kind of content I'm passionate about creating, not feel-good messages that leave you unchanged, but practical spiritual technology that you can actually use to transform your daily experience. If this resonates with where you are in your spiritual journey, I'd love to have you subscribe to the channel, because there's so much more we're going to explore together. These aren't topics you hear discussed everywhere, and I'm committed to going as deep as necessary to give you real tools for real transformation. For those of you who made it all the way to the end, drop a comment below saying, "This message was for me." I read every comment, and there's something powerful about declaring your readiness to receive these deeper teachings. And if this conversation created that sense of recognition and possibility that we've been building together throughout this entire video, a like helps more people find content that goes beyond spiritual entertainment to actual spiritual empowerment. There's a video right here that takes this understanding of Christ consciousness even deeper into practical application. We're going to explore how to maintain this level of spiritual thinking when life gets really challenging, because that's where the rubber meets the road in authentic spiritual development. Click and continue with me over there, because what we're building together is just getting started.